Howdy folks, I don't want to waste your time and I want to keep this video's run length at a reasonable amount of time, so I'm going to jump right into it. This weekend, January 15th through the 16th, is the Arena Open, and the week after that is the Neon Dynasty Set Championship Qualifier Weekend. And both of those events are going to be Alchemy. So we're in a position right now where there's a lot of attention on the Alchemy format, but there's basically no high-level tournament data to draw from. As a result, I wanted to record a video talking about where the rough state of the format is, what decks are popular, and roughly what tier those decks fall in, so that you can make a decision about what to expect to play against, and potentially what deck you want to play. So, as a result, the ratings that you see on the screen behind me are my personal interpretation of how good of a choice the decks are, not necessarily their likely popularity. For example, Dragons is probably going to be a relatively popular deck, and your removal choices should probably reflect that, but I don't think that it's a good choice to play. I'm going to go over each of these decks in depth a little more individually after this, including what cards are popular in them, and more about what defines them as an archetype. But for now, I'm going to talk about them in a broad sense to give you a picture of the metagame as a whole and how each of these decks kind of relates to one another. First up, Esper Control is more or less the top deck of the format right now. Andrew Cuneo's list, I believe, is the most popular version of these and kind of meets this critical density of a deck that is very good and also that is popularized enough that you're probably going to see it a lot, because a lot of people are going to bring it, and it's going to win a lot. Esper Control, more than anything else, is kind of the deck that defines the format, in my opinion, largely because it's in a position with control decks, in a position that control decks usually get to, where their effective spread of answers is really good against pretty much everything. Control tends to be really effective when that condition gets met, because it's in an open field harder to have one random deck that completely destroys you. So, with that said, I'm going to be evaluating pretty much every other list. Yeah, list works. List is a reasonable word. I'm going to be evaluating pretty much every other deck based on how that list performs against Esper Control, and that's going to affect largely what decks I think people should be playing. So, first up, or next up, I suppose, first up of the challengers, Sanguine Brushstroke decks. And these tend to be a lot of different types of decks that I've kind of all labeled under one category for my ease of mind. But they more or less run a gambit from aggro to midrange, and I think can be kind of cleanly separated into those two different categories. The mid-rangey versions tend to be either mono-black or Orzhov for better removal than the mono-black versions. They tend to be grindy and tend to be good against creature decks because they pack a lot of removal. On the other hand, they tend to be bad against control decks, including Esper, because they have a lot of dead removal and tend not to be as capable of actually clocking Esper. The versions that tend to be more aggressive tend to either be Mardu or red-black, and tend to just play fewer removal spells and more creatures that make the opponent's life total go down. I'm of the opinion that the aggressive versions are probably better, because I'm of the opinion that fighting Esper should probably be your primary concern. Izzet Epiphany is still a deck in the format, and I think that it's pretty good. It did get a major nerf to Alrund's Epiphany. It no longer makes birds unless you foretold it, which means that by default every copy of Alrund's Epiphany makes no birds ever. And it also doesn't get cheaper if you foretell it. But Izzet Epiphany's kind of in a weird spot in the format because it's not very solved. The big trade-off that it's gotten is that Geist Channeler and Discover the Formula are very good cards in the list. The cost reduction element and the way that the cost reductions continue to apply even in the graveyard for Lear means that the deck can do some very, very busted things earlier than it used to be able to, including casting Galvanic Iteration into Unexpected Windfall on turn 4. which is very good. But building the deck is tricky, and the lack of birds off of Alrund's Epiphany against aggro decks means that a lot more of the deck's hands, especially the ones that are top-heavy, don't turn the corner and stabilize against aggro decks as quickly as the deck used to. That said, Unexpected Windfall and Galvanic Iteration still remain the best way to completely dunk on other control decks, and more than almost any other deck on this list, I think Izzet Epiphany has the best potential to be built to beat Esper Control. But I don't expect the deck to be super popular in the coming weeks, because I don't think that there's going to really be a consensus way to build it anytime soon. Mono Green and Green Red Aggro are more or less the same lists that you would see in Standard and are pretty close to one another. The biggest differences between the two are that Mono Green tends to be better against other creature decks. It tends to have better access to a snow mana base and access to Blizzard Brawl as a result. And the green-red version tends to be slightly better against control decks because it has access to a few more hasty creatures and a few more multicolored creatures that are more resilient to Esper's Vanishing Verse removal package. Next up, Blue-White Control differs from Esper primarily because of the removal that it plays. Esper's removal tends to be more effective, and Blue-White tends to run slightly less effective removal but have a better mana base. In my opinion, the mana base difference really isn't enough to make Blue-White Control better than Esper, but it still ranks pretty highly because the deck as a whole is still really good. It's just a really good deck that there seems to be a slightly better and likely a more popular version of. The other deck on this tier is Blue-Black Control, which I don't expect to be super popular and is more of a personal brew of mine, which makes me kind of biased, but also makes me kind of blind to how popular it might actually be. Essentially, the big difference between Blue-Black Control and the other versions of Control is that it tends to run more hand hate, which gives it an edge in control mirrors. And although the new hand hate options in Alchemy are not as good as, say, Thoughtseize, they are very flexible and tend to be better against aggro than a lot of the hand hate that we've seen previously. Mono White is still a deck in Alchemy, but it isn't a major deck. It's not super popular, and I wouldn't expect to see a ton of it as a result. That said, it isn't significantly nerfed, but it's weak against decks that run Meathook Massacre, which, considering the main non-aggro decks in the format are Esper and Sanguine Brushstroke decks, which both run Meathook Massacre, it leaves Mono White in even a worse spot than it is in Standard on the whole of things. But Adeline is still a popular card, and it's still very powerful, so it wouldn't surprise me to run up against Mono White, but on the whole, people have been playing newer, flashier decks, so I wouldn't expect to see a ton of Mono White. Clerics, on the other hand, is more of a darling of the Alchemy format. I don't know whether to expect that it'll be super popular, although historically so far on the ladder it seems like it is, or alchemically maybe. Clerics runs the gambit from white to white-black to Esper, and does a couple of different things, but primarily I think that the white-black version is probably the best. And Clerics, more than anything else on this list, tends to have pretty polarized matchups. It generally does bad against decks that have unconditional board wipes or lots of spot removal, but it tends to do pretty good against decks with lots of creatures that need to attack to win, or that have conditional board wipes like Meathook Massacre. Basically, the idea with Clerics is that you gain a ton of life and grow your creatures really large with life gain triggers, which means Meathook Massacre is hard to use to kill any of your creatures, and anything that wants to attack you has to race a ton of life gain and some very large creatures. But because the deck is all about building up onboard synergies, it tends to fold very hard to your opponent just having a hard board wipe that doesn't care that your creatures have 8 toughness. Next up, dragons, which is probably the hot topic of this list in the sense that some people are going to be very upset that I'm throwing them under a bus, but it's not a super good list, despite being the darling of the format. As far as I can tell, that's mostly because people like really flashy decks, and even more people like the idea of Dragons, the Tribe, and getting to play an entire deck of Dragons, the Tribe. But here's the general gist behind Dragons. It's a aggressive list because it can't do anything else. It doesn't have the grindy tools to be a mid-range deck, and it definitely doesn't have the ability to be a control-y deck. You can play blue-red Dragons and try to splash for counterspells, but unless you're curving into exactly an unanswered Goldspan, which is harder than it used to be because spot removal now kills Goldspan without giving you your mana back, it doesn't hold up extra mana terribly well. So that leaves Dragons in a place where it needs to race every other deck. And it looks like it can do that because it plays a bunch of ramp spells and a bunch of big dragons. The problem is, it has to curve out because it's an aggro deck. It can't do the ramp thing of stabilizing later because it doesn't actually have any super huge impact cards that dominate the board like traditional ramp finishers. So it needs to have ramp spells on curve, and it needs to have payoffs after them, and when everything comes together and it lives in Christmas land, the result is a normal functional deck. Which, cool, okay. The problem is, unlike an aggro deck, it can't just combine 5 cards that cost 2 mana in its opening hand into a functional curve, because all of those cards are actually ramp cards, not threats. And that results in a deck that looks really insane when you see your opponent playing it, because everything goes perfectly and according to plan, but when you try to play it a wildly unacceptable percentage of the time, you look at hands that just mulligan into oblivion or don't do anything. Not a deck I would recommend, but a deck you're probably going to see. And finally, I have Izzet Mill on this list, which is a relative newcomer to the format, and I don't have a ton of experience with it, so I don't know exactly where to place it relative to these other decks. I don't have enough testing with it, essentially. But I think it's a deck with a lot of potential, and I do think that it's my due diligence to make you aware of it, especially how it functions, because if you're going to try to play a control deck against it, you're going to need to know how that works, because it's more or less a combo deck despite being called a mill deck. The versions that have been popular so far are traditionally best of 1 lists, and I don't know exactly how the deck will be capable of transitioning into best of 3, but we're going to go over it and I'll kind of explain what it looks like. So to look at the decks in more depth, the first one we're going to look at is Esper Control. The big cards here are the removal package, which are Meathook Massacre, Vanishing Verse, Parasitic Grasp, and Infernal Grasp in different numbers. We're not going to be looking at 75 card lists for the most part here. There's going to be too much variance, especially in the less defined archetypes, in what the exact distribution of spells are, but we're going to more kind of focus on what the general cards to expect in a deck are, and how to imagine they line up against other popular decks. But in this case, it's worth noting that the most popular versions of Esper tend to run 4 Vanishing Verse, and then usually 1 Infernal Grasp, 2 Parasitic Grasp. This is a big deal because it means that things that are weak against Vanishing Verse are not the most well-positioned in the format, and things that dodge Vanishing Verse, especially early aggressive creatures, have a premium put on them. Similarly, things that Parasitic Grasp has to pay more mana for are a lot better. Notably, this means things like Werewolf Pack Leader, a 3-drop that is a human the turn it comes down, or actually every turn, I guess, because it never stops being human, unlike other werewolves that are transformed. But it dies to Parasitic Grasp on turn 2, whereas a 2-drop Black-Red Vampire dies to neither Parasitic Grasp on turn 2, because it isn't a human, and also doesn't die to Vanishing Verse, because it isn't monocolored. Something to consider when you are figuring out the distribution for creatures in your aggressive decks. But beyond that, the deck primarily leans on Meathook Massacre as its board wipe of choice, which means that it doesn't have hard removal for very large creatures that are multiple colors, beyond the usual package that Lear decks have of Fading Hope. I've included Divine Purge here because it is a board wipe that the deck can run, and it tends to be more effective than Meathook Massacre against decks that have large creatures, like Clerics and Mono Green. That said, a lot of versions of Esper cut it completely, because the mana base doesn't really want to support playing double white spells. So aside from the card advantage packages of Memory Deluge, Leer, and Discover the Formula, which is the way that the game, or that the deck typically accrues enough advantage that it wins the game eventually, and for the most part the win con is get more cards than your opponent and then, I don't know, beat them down with Leer or Hall of the Storm Giants. It isn't really concerned about that. But the other package the deck has to get ahead is Teferi plus Key to the Archive. And I should probably get my thoughts out of the way on this now. Teferi and Key to the Archive are kind of a complicated set of cards in Alchemy, in the sense that I personally don't think they're super great because they're not very good in control mirrors. Both of the cards individually tend to not be super critical or good on their own. Key to the Archive gets a little better in Leer decks because you actually get some form of card advantage off of it. Say, if you draft a card and it's a good card, then you get to use it twice. But if you draft a card and it's a mediocre card, you can discard it to itself and then flash it back with Leer later for some sort of card advantage. When you have both Teferi and Key to the Archive, suddenly Key to the Archive is making 4 mana a turn, and the mana acceleration combined with all of your removal spells and card advantage tend to seal up games, if not end them, pretty quickly. The big problem is mostly that Teferi isn't super great on its own, outside of against just dedicated aggressive decks, which makes the two of them enough of a liability in control mirrors that I tend to think you can build a functional deck without them. But sort of similar to dragons, you're gonna see a lot of them because they're flashy and cool and popular, and we'll see where the meta goes in the long run. But if you want to consider playing this deck, try testing out versions cutting Key to the Archives into Teferi for more instant speed interaction and potentially the ability to hold up more more counter spells. You're probably going to find you're winning control mirrors more than your opponents. So lastly, some sideboard cards to consider. Duress, Break Expectations, and Go Blank are ways to get ahead and get some card advantage in the mirror. Notably, if you are removing your opponent's access to counter magic and getting information with permission spells like Break Expectations and Duress, then it can be much easier to resolve your own big card advantage spells like Discover the Formula or Memory Deluge at points where you know your opponent doesn't have an answer. Unlike a lot of other control mirrors in the past that have had big swingy cards like Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, or Alrund's Epiphany, that at sorcery speed totally take over the game, these decks don't really have anything that completely takes over the game if it resolves, and largely that's in part due to the removal packages being pretty good against one another. Vanishing Verse hits Leer and Hullbreaker Horror, so does Infernal Grasp. So you can play a tap-out game plan more effectively than in other mirrors. Goldspan Dragon is another example of a card that prevents you from tapping out in advance, because if you tap out for a Key to the Archive, you can't beat a Goldspan Dragon. So it can be more acceptable to tap out with these decks than perhaps control decks that you're used to in the past, but having instant speed card advantage still tends to win control mirrors more often than not, and cards like Malevolent Hermit, Disdainful Stroke, and Test Talents out of the sideboard tend to mean that the matchups are more oriented around that post-board than they are pre-board. Also worth noting, Break Expectations, I think, tends to get a slight edge over Duress because it does hit Hullbreaker Horror, and that can be one of the cards that is the most difficult to answer post-board once you get to one player having a mana advantage over the other. Next up, we're going to talk about the mid-rangey version of the Sanguine Brushstroke decks. These decks tend to be higher on 1-drop sacrifice fodder, and cards like Deadly Dispute and Fell Stinger. They also tend to be slower than the other versions of the Sanguine Brushstroke decks because they have less aggressive creatures, like I mentioned earlier, and that tends to make them better against creature decks, worse against control decks, and I'm of the opinion that you should orient your deck more around control decks right now, but in general, these tend to get additionally defined by Rite of Oblivion, Wedding Announcement, and Edgar if they go Orzhov, or Blood on the Snow and Lolth if they go mono black. The Blood on the Snow versions tend to be pretty similar to what you've probably seen in Standard, and I would expect to not see a ton of these, because I think they're probably going to get hated out by the control decks by day 2, but be aware of them and be mindful if you decide to play a creature-based deck that these are probably going to try to grind you out, and they're probably going to be successful. They have a lot of chump blockers, and they tend to gain a ton of life through Meathook Massacre. Notably, Blood Vial Purveyor is a card that if you decide to play mono green, will shut down a lot. So anytime you're playing a creature deck against these, be aware that any black deck can play Blood Vial Purveyor and choose your removal spells accordingly. The multicolored Sanguine Brushstroke decks, on the other hand, tend to be more about things like Blood Tithe Harvester, Ange, and Kalain to get faster starts and put more pressure onto the board, lower their opponent's life total more quickly, and then burn the opponent out with Sanguine Brushstroke. They can still try to play more sacrifice fodder, and Deadly Dispute tends to still be a part of the decks in some way. It synergizes very well with Sanguine Brushstroke in general, but they tend to have fewer 1-drops to sacrifice to those things. They typically don't come in Orzhov form. The Orzhov decks still tend to be largely mid-rangey. There just aren't a ton of super good aggressive creatures available in straight white-black, but the aggressive decks do tend to either come in red-black or Mardu. The Mardu ones stretch their mana base a little bit, but tend to get access to dabbling in the mid-range elements that the other Sanguine Brushstroke decks have when they're playing against creature decks, while still having access to a lot of the red-black version's aggressive orientation, especially after sideboard, against the control decks. And Wedding Announcement and Edgar both do a pretty good aggro impression, even if the straight white-black versions of the deck tend to have fewer 2-drops to take advantage of that. Izzet Epiphany is very similar to Standard, like I was describing earlier, with the big difference being the way that it has to approach Alrund's Epiphany. It doesn't really want to foretell it anymore because it wants to discount the cost with Discover the Formula and Geist Channeler, but the deck now gets to take control of the game a lot more effectively with Leer, because Discover the Formula discounting Leer means you might only be spending 3 or 2 mana to play the Leer, and also all of the spells in your graveyard tend to cost a lot less. Having a 1 mana Divide by 0 in hand because you discounted it with Geist Channeler makes it really easy to turn the corner and protect your Leer. Additionally, Burn Down the House tends to take on a new combo element in the deck once its mana cost goes down by a lot, because instead of copying Alrund's Epiphany 2 or 3 times, you can get a lot of burn damage done by burning down the house 2 or 3 times and making a absolute huge swarm of devils. You can even get to the point where you cast a bunch of burn down the houses to make devils, swing with them, and then cast a different burn down the house to kill all your devils to do the last couple of points of damage. But on the whole of things, Unexpected Windfall is still the defining card of this list, and especially once copied, tends to give such a carded mana advantage that it is very difficult for other control decks to beat it. That tends to make it the best pick, in my opinion, to try to fight other control decks with, especially the control decks that are oriented around tapping out for things like Key to the Archives or Teferi. They just can't do that and not fall terribly far behind because you resolved an Unexpected Windfall. The deck likely changes its sideboard configuration a lot compared to the standard versions. In particular, I think Malevolent Hermit is a card that is a lot better in Alchemy than it is in Standard, because in Standard, Malevolent Hermit tends to get completely destroyed by Smoldering Egg in mirror matches, but does not get interacted with very effectively by the removal spells out of Esper or Blue-White. It may sound like Vanishing Verse answers it very cleanly and removes the backside, but anytime you have 1 extra mana, you can just sacrifice the Malevolent Hermit to counter the Vanishing Verse, and yeah, you don't actually counter the Vanishing Verse, but your Malevolent Hermit is still sitting around to get flashbacked later, and unlike Izzet, throwing out a bunch of spells when you have the backside of Malevolent Hermit in play is really good against Esper, because their ability to play threats after you tap out at sorcery speed is a lot more limited than Izzet decks. There's just no way that your opponent playing Key to the Archive is as scary as your opponent playing 2 copies of Alrund's Epiphany. That said, as I mentioned earlier, Trying to figure out the exact way to build Izzet right now is something that hasn't been discovered, and it has a lot of problems against other aggro decks because Alrund's Epiphany itself isn't as much of a catch-all as it used to be, that you could just play to stabilize and get a couple of extra turns and a couple of extra blockers. Where that has Izzet falling anytime soon, I don't know. I don't think you're going to play against this deck much, but I do think that if you're in the market for trying to beat Control, it's probably one of the most promising places to explore. And if you find a very effective mixture of answers to aggro creatures that don't just leave you totally flooded with useless removal against Control, let me know. I really want to make this deck work. Mono green looks very familiar if you've played Standard recently. The main changes are the addition of Tenacious Pup and Lupine Harbinger, as well as Grizzled Huntmaster that does a lot of nifty things out of the sideboard. The primary difference is most of the time Asika's Chariot doesn't see play in these decks now, having been replaced by other 4-drop haste creatures due to the nerf to Chariot. That said, Mono Green doesn't have its creatures line up super effectively against the white removal in the format. Vanishing Verse in particular, but also Divine Purge. So that leaves Mono Green in kind of a rough spot. It has game against everything, and it still stomps on stuff that has hiccups in its curve as well as it ever did, and does a pretty good job against other creature decks, including the Sanguine Brushstroke decks that aren't packing super heavy amounts of removal, because the deck has access to a lot of trample. But it has to lean very heavy on Snakeskin Veil against control decks, and it needs to manage to get a lot of damage in with its early creatures so that its 4-drops do a good job of getting the last couple of points of damage in after a board wipe. And it can be tough to make all of that come together against the control decks right now because they have access to a lot of removal that lines up well. The green-red decks tend to be in sort of a similar spot to mono-green, with the exception of, against control decks, cards like Kessig Naturalist, Tovolar, and Halana and Alena tend to be slightly better against Vanishing Verse heavy lists, and the addition of more sources of hasty threats tends to be slightly better to recover post-board wipes. That said, a larger percentage of the creatures in these decks tend to die to Parasitic Grasp, and that's just about the worst thing you can have happen to you, because it means your opponent didn't use a Vanishing Verse that they want to use on your creatures later on, and they gain 3 life, which you don't like. But on the whole of things, Goldspan Dragon and Reckless Stormseeker are very good threats, same as ever, and the deck also gets access to more things like Kessig Naturalist and potentially Magda that let them ramp into their big 4-drop threats, of which they can play any combination and any number, including Townraiser Tyrant, which tends to be a pretty effective card to play early against control, because it tends to do some points of damage over the next couple of turns by burning the land, regardless of whether your opponent has a removal spell immediately for it or not. And when control decks tend to lead heavier on Fading Hope, which a lot of versions do, then they aren't quite as happy to bounce a Townraiser Tyrant as they are to bounce a 4/4 hasty threat. That said, the cards you see here are more intended to be illustrative of different ways the deck can be built, and more than most, you won't see all of these cards in the same list. Notably, Jaspera Sentinel and Magda can be something this deck does, but often won't do at the same time as playing all of these 2-drop all at once. It's also worth noting that Tenacious Pup giving Vigilance to Magda means that without a Jaspera Sentinel, the list kind of behaves more awkwardly than it would like to. But Tenacious Pup does give Jaspera Sentinel something to tap down. I think that there is less of a definitive build of this deck than Mono Green, or even some of the other aggro decks, but it does tend to, in my opinion, have a little more potential to be a way to hedge against control decks than what Mono Green has access to. As I mentioned earlier, the big difference between Blue-White and Esper is that Blue-White makes some slightly less effective card choices in the name of having a better mana base, which I don't personally think is enough of an edge. The Esper mana base is relatively functional, but in order to make that exchange happen, It uses Fateful Absence and Sunset Revelry as its anti-aggro early removal cards, and Divine Purge as the main board wipe. Divine Purge has an interesting interaction with Fateful Absence, where it actually exiles the clue token that gets made, but it's not as good of an interaction as it sounds, because it implies that you're Fateful Absencing something early on, and then there's less stuff to use Divine Purge on. But if you Fateful Absence something early, the clue usually sticks around until your opponent actually runs out of action, so you can still get away with playing a turn 4 or 5 Divine Purge, and you're probably still going to catch the clue token that you played on turn 2 or 3. But on the whole of things, Sunset Revelry tends to not be as effective a removal option. It's fine against aggro, but it's not super exciting against control decks, whereas Vanishing Verse actually is a relatively decent answer to control decks. Similarly, Divine Purge doesn't tend to do a lot against control decks, so you're not actually getting rid of the clue token that Fateful Absence leaves behind in those matchups, and those also tend to be the matchups that really revolve around which player has card advantage or not. Unlike Esper, these lists also tend to play more copies of Teferi to go with 4 Key to the Archives. Stock is that Esper plays 1 Teferi and 4 Key to the Archives. Stock for blue-white tends to be that it plays 4 and 4, which, because of the reasons I mentioned earlier, I think leaves blue-white in an even worse position than Esper in control mirrors, and it also lacks access to the hand-hate spells that Esper gets access to, which means it has a harder time finding good opportunities to resolve its card draw spells. That said, you can kind of make up for that by playing a larger density of card draw spells than the Esper decks do out of your board, which, because you're not playing those hand-hate spells, you do have room for. So you can stock up on more copies of Memory Deluge, more copies of Behold the Multiverse, potentially more copies of Discover the Formula, although I don't think that that's a great route to go against control mirrors, being that it is so vulnerable to counterspells, especially without access to hand hate to clear the way. But all of that is an option. Personally, I'd recommend, if you want to try to take that approach, do more of a split between stuff like Memory Deluge and Behold the Multiverse to be less completely destroyed by Test of Talents. And in that same vein, similar to every control deck, there's probably a lot to be gained from trying to play a broad suite of counterspells in your sideboard, including, what's the name of that card? Malevolent Hermit. Malevolent Hermit's first mode, where it mana leaks something, is less great in these blue-white control mirrors, because mana leak tends to fall off as the decks draw a bunch of cards and play a bunch of lands and don't have a way to kill each other. And unlike Izzet, the uncounterable backside is less of a threat here. But more often than not, most of the blue-white / Esper control mirrors tend to come down to who actually gets enough card advantage and mana advantage to resolve Hullbreaker Horror, which also often comes down to who resolves more Key to the Archives. As a result, although Test of Talents is really good against Memory Deluge, Disdainful Stroke can be a stronger choice because it does more to prevent your opponent from getting a mana advantage on you. So like I mentioned earlier, Blue-Black Control is more of a pet deck of mine. The biggest differences compared to Esper are a increased focus on hand hate with main deck break expectations that works better than you would expect with Lear, as well as a discount spells theme with Geist Channeler, and more copies of Behold the Multiverse and Discover the Formula that works really well with Lear. As a result, these tend to be more Lear decks than the Esper decks are, but lacking Vanishing Verse tend to have less broad removal and can be a little closer against aggro as a result. Sorin the Mirthless tends to be a very good anti-aggro card, and the version that I'm playing right now plays more in the sideboard. The lifelinking vampires especially are relevant against Brushstroke decks, because you need a way to not just get drained to death over time, because your win conditions tend not to win the game very fast in this deck, with card advantage being the traditional way that games get finished. So unlike Esper, that doesn't have as easy time running a lot of Sorins, you can have pretty clean games against Brushstroke comparatively, but your lack of Vanishing Verse means that some of the individual cards early on are just going to get bounced by Fading Hope, and unless you find your own Meathook Massacres, you might have a tough time against aggro decks comparatively. Mono White looks very similar to what you're probably familiar with in Standard, the big difference being that Luminarch Aspirant is now nerfed. That means that the deck is less capable of doing aggression. Specifically, the nerf is that it now puts the +1/+1 counter on the instep instead of at the beginning of the combat step, so that +1 power every turn doesn't have haste, which adds up. The other big difference is that the deck now has access to playing Inquisitor Captain, which can get more creatures like Elite Spellbinder or Raidane that help against control decks by disrupting the removal spells that they're trying to do. But compared to Standard, the big flaw with Mono White right now is that there are a lot more decks playing Meathook Massacre, and Mono White really doesn't like playing against Meathook Massacre. The life gain element of it is a big problem, and Mono White also tends to have creatures with relatively low toughness coming down, so Meathook Massacre clears everything up pretty early on in the game. That said, Adeline is still a house, and getting to play it on turn 3 is still absolutely stellar, especially if you have Thalias and Spellbinders and Raidane at some other point on your curve to keep the opponent off their toes. Or, is it on their toes? I suppose either one works. The key engine in Clerics, although this is only one of the engines, is Voice of the Blessed and Cleric of Lifespawn, cards that get +1/+1 counters on them every time you gain life, and more or less everything in the deck is built around that. The other major card is Righteous Valkyrie, that once your life total gets high enough, anthems up all your creatures. This tends to mean that out of all of the decks in Alchemy right now, Clerics builds up the biggest, swollest creatures out of any of them, and most of those creatures tend to fly, which means that the deck has pretty good interaction against dragons, who tends to have creatures that stay in the 4/4 range, and that tends to not be able to remove anything that actually gets big. As a result, Clerics was a really popular deck early on, but might become less popular as that being the primary matchup that it preyed on. That matchup might go away over time. But that said, the way these creatures get really big also means that Clerics is pretty well positioned against Meathook Massacre decks, provided that it doesn't face a Meathook Massacre so early that it clears out all the Lunarch Veterans, Traveling Ministers, and other small Clerics that the deck tries to play early on to develop the necessary life gain engine. The other notable things that the deck has, in addition to just the usual mono-white suite of aggressive/disruptive creatures, is Pyre of Heroes and Aura. It gives the deck some resilience against hard board wipes, because it can reliably tutor for Aura, and then sacrificing their Clerics to go get other Clerics with Pyre of Heroes is really strong with Aura in play, because it means they get to start rebuying very disruptive creatures like Elite Spellbinders or Sigardian Evangel that helps tap down creatures to go for lethal. Additionally, some versions that splash for the 3-color version of the deck run Inquisitor Captain with the hope of hitting Glasspool Mimic. My opinion is that's not the right way to build it, and I would stick to white-black, trying to be as aggressive as possible, because you still have to beat hard board wipes out of control. Now, that said, Aura and Clerics of Lifespawn do dodge Vanishing Verse, which is nice, and a lot of versions of Esper tend to only be playing Meathook Massacre as the board wipe, which this deck is well positioned against. Blue-white, on the other hand, that actually plays Divine Purge, which exiles everything and gets around Aura, well, everything except Aura anyway, or that are playing actual hard removal that doesn't care how much toughness you have, like Doomscar, and I totally didn't have to pause the video to go look that up or anything, tend to be better against Clerics. That said, if you have Aura in play, you have a slightly better time against Doomscar, but on the whole of things, I would advise playing white-black Clerics and eschewing the Glasspool Mimic Inquisitor Captain combo, because as fun as that seems, and as much as that combo's off in Historic, it's not really leaning into the deck's strengths in Alchemy. So to do my due diligence, much like the Brushstroke decks, the Dragons decks tend to come in a lot of different color combinations, namely and largely mono red, red black, and red white. In my experience, the red black version is the best, but all of them tend to follow the same patterns of strengths and weaknesses. They are good aggro decks that, when the early cards ramp them into good aggressive creatures earlier than they should have them, tend to function pretty well. But all of them tend to have the weakness of they don't turn into good mid-range or control-y decks. They lack card advantage and just tend not to scale. So most of the different color combinations of the decks try different ways to address this. Black-red tends to be a better aggressive list, with cards like Kalane, Graveyard Trespasser, and Immerstorm Predator giving it more reasonable aggressive options on curve. Kalane probably being the ideal ramp spell for the list because it actually puts a creature with power into play early on, before your opponent might have access to removal, and increases the power of the creature that you play next turn, as opposed to Orb of Dragonkind or Magda that just make normal-sized creatures next turn. The red-white lists tend to be better against other creature decks because Angelfire Ignition and Adult Gold Dragon give them some evasive life gain options. Nadar kind of fills the curve that the deck needs when it doesn't find a ramp spell on 2, but for the most part the deck's already in trouble when that happened, and Nadar doesn't save it. But unlike other 3-drop options, such as Graveyard Trespasser, that are trying to do that role, it does scale better when you have a Fearsome Whelp early and enable turns where you start playing 2 cards at once sooner. The mono-red version tends to play Chandra dressed Kill in that role, which does ramp better into the 5-drops, and sort of similar to Showdown of the Scalds, tends to help you play a mid-range game plan with card advantage slightly better, but in my opinion it doesn't do that role well enough to really make up for the fact that when you're not having a completely ideal start, the wheels kind of fall off the bus and the deck doesn't really function as well as you'd like. But those are more or less what you can expect to play against when you see this deck pop up. And the other thing you should note is don't get too disheartened when you see your opponent's dragon deck play Fearsome Whelp, because if you spend some time playing this deck, what you're going to find is there is a lot of time where you keep a hand with turn 2 Fearsome Whelp and fail to draw into any dragons to actually discount with it. And for the final deck that we're going to be taking a look at today, it's Izzet Mill. This list is less defined in best of 3, and I'm going to try to describe roughly what the deck does. It's, as you would expect, an Izzet Mill deck, but it's more of a combo deck than other mill decks that you might have seen. It plays Maddening Epiphany and Ruin Crab to try to mill your opponent early, to get your opponent's deck size down to the point where a couple Tasha's Hideous Laughters will one-shot them, as well as in the case of Ruin Crab to buy you a couple more times against turns. But for the most part, it's trying to play Dual Strikes and Galvanic Iterations to copy a bunch of Hideous Laughters all in one turn for a combo win con. Beyond that, it uses Cathartic Pyre, Demon Bolt, Divide by Zero, and Fading Hope in some different combination to give it things to do on the early turns to not die against aggressive decks. And some versions will play things like Unexpected Conversion or Unexpected Windfall, especially with copy spells, to get to the point where it actually finds Hideous Laughter, and it's a deck that doesn't function very well if it fails to find Hideous Laughter, as well as to have the requisite amount of mana necessary to combo off in time to not die. The main thing that's really interesting to me about this deck, and that has me interested in its best of 3 potential, is that the deck plays on an axis that is something that the control decks that currently exist might not be well positioned to play against. The creature-based removal packages that they kind of thrive on right now don't really do anything to this deck, because removing a Ruin Crab isn't really the biggest deal in the world. That said, in best of 3 especially, the deck is very weak to getting Tasha's Hideous Laughter or Galvanic Iteration Test of Talents, and it's also somewhat weak to Hand Hate because it needs to build up cards in hand to get to a critical mass of combo pieces to come together. But it also is a deck that, with the right sideboarding techniques, could have all of those weaknesses kind of turned on their head, because it can benefit from removing all of the removal and boarding into just huge amounts of diversified test of talents and card advantage and other things to just dirtle and build up to one super big impactful combo turn. And with the control decks that exist, not having access to super clean sideboard plans that cut all of the removal, that might be a way to just play a control deck essentially post-board with a much, much better combo win con to punish your opponents for tapping out at any point. We'll see going forward, and this is one I want to experiment with, but it is definitely a deck that, especially if you play in the best of one queues for day one of the Arena Open, expect to see it. So to wrap things up, that's more or less the Alchemy meta as it stands right now in a nutshell. Assuming you haven't turned this video off, thanks for watching. This is the first time I've done something like this that is pre-recorded content, so hope you found it enjoyable and helpful. Oh, right, and I'm new to this YouTube thing, so I kind of forgot. I think this is the part where I'm supposed to try to shill myself. So, if you liked the video and you're interested in seeing mostly edited down content from my streams to be a little more watchable, give the channel a follow and give the video a like. I'd appreciate it. Did I do that right? I think that's how this is supposed to work.